everyone, welcome back to Actual Conversations. Today we're going to do another monologue here, but on something a little different. It's an issue that I'm actually very passionate about. And I believe it's an issue that relates to a lot of other problems we face in America today, and that is the tax system. I've recently been reading a book by Neil Bortz and former Congressman John Linder called the FairTax book. And it's very interesting. It's very similar to my own project that I've been working on for a while. The basic idea of it is eliminating the current tax code in the IRS and replacing it with a consumption tax on retail sales. I'll leave a link to the book in the descriptions. But before we get into the idea, I think it's important that we talk about the status of the current system, and kind of some of the problems that I think are obvious and also not so obvious. Both Vox and the Tax Foundation conclude that the total amount of pages between the tax code, revenue rulings, regulations, and case law, all of which are things that affect us, essentially, the citizens, and can hold us liable, either in terms of fines or possibly even prison. The total amount of pages is 70,000 pages long, which is astronomical, and I would bet that almost none of us have read any of it. But among these pages are also untold amounts of direct taxes that we're familiar with, such as the income taxes and death taxes and gift taxes and all sorts of taxes that have, I guess you can call them direct taxes, but also indirect taxes, such as taxes resulting from regulations that require businesses to, or cost money to require, they require businesses to spend money to comply with them, and also things such as embedded taxes. I've read in Bortz's book, and actually in a couple other books I've read, the cost for compliance with the tax code is astronomical. It's somewhere between, a good estimate really actually is about $500 billion, according to both Bortz and the Tax Foundation. And because the code is so massive and open to interpretation, no one can really be confident in their filing. And a good example of this is actually also in Bortz's book. Money Magazine sent data to 49 different professional tax collection agencies, and not one of them was returned the same way, suggesting that it is so complicated and there are a lot of different ways to do things, and a lot of it's just open to interpretation. And moreover, another study shown in Bortz's book showed that even while filing under the direction of the IRS itself, more than half of the returns were wrong or incorrectly filed, which kind of doubles down on the point that the tax code it's just not understandable to not even the people whose jobs it is to understand it, and I don't blame them, honestly. But I think there are more dangerous aspects to the tax code. For example, or I should say not just the tax code, but the idea of the income tax in general. One of them being that if you look at the language of the 16th Amendment, which allows Congress to tax our incomes, there's no limiting language in there. So in actuality, 100% of your income could be taxed, and it would be 100% legal. But the idea of filing under the penalty of perjury suggests that if you don't give the correct amount to the government, that somehow part of your income actually really doesn't belong to you, that it belongs to the government, and they have a vested interest in making sure that they get exactly what is theirs, and not a concept of, well, this is my money that I am going to give the government of my own benevolence. No, it kind of sets a very interesting precedent. In addition to all that, they can come after you for filings from years ago. I believe that it's actually 7 years. They have 7 years of filings that they can always come after you for. And let's consider the actual agency itself. It's funded by your own money, and this agency has enormous powers to garnish your wages, impose liens against your assets, it can shut down your business, and it can quite literally destroy your life. And I think all of this suggests that taxes are not an issue of economics and numbers and money alone. In actuality, we are talking about people, we're talking about the lives of people and the quality of life of people, and we're talking about how the government really interacts with its people with such a sensitive topic. I think if we all agree that human life has the most value, and we spend most of our lives, most of our life working and acquiring wealth and acquiring property, that I think there's something to be said about the value of property, that property deserves special protections and special treatments. And I think this of course reminds me of John Locke, and I think a lot of the source authority for the founders that emphasized the importance of private property rights during the founding period. I think when we take into account the current tax code and the enforcement of it by the IRS, I think a strong case could be made that we're not actually the owners of our own property. We are just temporary stewards of property that is already owned by the government, which is a really scary principle and precedent that you see when you look at the 16th Amendment, when you look at the laws that kind of govern us around our incomes and our money, and quite literally the powers that the government has to take it away when they think that they're being cheated. I have a couple stories that emphasize the power of the IRS that I'm going to read to you. One of them is a chemical company, Roman Haas. The other is the story of Alex and Kay Counsel. The other is actually a story involving Neil Bortz himself, the author of the FairTax book. And the last one is the story of Bruce Barron from actually Todd Douglas's book, A Republic If You Can Keep It. Let's see, let me begin. So this is the story of Roman Haas. On March 22nd, 1985, the Associated Press sent a story down the wires headlined, IRS tries to penalize chemical company $46,000 for being a dime short. The so-called offender was Roman Haas in Philadelphia, a company that makes chemicals that do everything from keeping fruits fresh to fighting disease. Roman Haas is a large enough company that in 1983 they sent a check to the IRS in payment of payroll taxes in the amount of $4,448,112.88. They exactly owed $4,448,112.98. The check was exactly 10 cents short. The IRS sent Roman Haas a letter telling them that they now owed $46,806.37 in penalties, all for being one dime short on the remittance of payroll taxes. It took many months and not so small amount spent on legal fees to get the IRS to drop the penalty. The second story, the story of Alex and Kay Counsel. The story of Alex and Kay Counsel shows the tragic lengths to which an honest citizen can be driven by IRS enforcement actions. In the late 1970s, an insurance executive named Alex Counsel received a sizable bonus at work and got involved in a tax shelter. His tax accountant told him it was a legitimate option, but the IRS disagreed. Counsel's liability for taxes due on the bonus expired at the end of 3 years. Nonetheless, after the statute of limitations had expired, the IRS sent the Counsels a notice demanding more than $180,000 in unpaid taxes on the bonus, a figure that included penalties and interest. The Counsel's accountant notified the IRS that the statute of limitations had expired on the Counsel's tax liability. 2 years later, the IRS wrote back to claim that they had mailed a certified letter to the Counsels prior to the expiration of the statute, notifying them of the deficiency. Okay, fair enough. Show us a copy of the certified letter and the receipt. No way. Not only did the IRS refuse to provide copies of a receipt for the letter, they wouldn't even tell the Counsels where the letter had been sent until yet another 2 years had passed. Wouldn't you know it, when the IRS finally coughed up the address to which they supposedly had sent the delinquency notice, the address was wrong. Now you would think this would pretty much end things, wouldn't you? By virtue of sending the notice to the wrong address, the IRS had failed to inform the Counsels of their tax liability within the time allotted. Well, that's not the way the IRS operates. When this matter found its way into the federal court system, the IRS informed the court that it was the Counsels' responsibility to prove they hadn't received the notice. In other words, the Counsels had the impossible task of proving a negative. As you might guess, the Counsels couldn't prove that they didn't receive the notice. So the IRS slapped a lien on their construction business for almost $300,000. The lien destroyed Alex Counsel's credit rating, and his business collapsed. Shortly thereafter, Alex Counsel left his wife the following letter. My dearest Kay, I have taken my life in order to provide capital for you. The IRS and its liens, which have been taken against our property illegally by a runaway agency of our government, have dried up all resources and sources of credit for us. So I have made the only decision I can. It's purely a business decision. I hope you can understand that. I love you completely. Alex. P.S. You will find my body on the north side of the house. Ultimately, the court threw out the IRS's claim against the counsels, but it was too late to save Alex's life. The next story, regarding Neil Bortz himself. It was the mid-1980s. My accountant surprised me with the news that I owed the IRS about $50,000 with the filing of my tax return. That was $50,000 I didn't have. I knew that not filing was a crime, so I filed without paying the $50,000, and then immediately contacted the IRS and asked to speak to an agent. I told him of my situation, and he agreed to work with me over the period of a year to cover the remainder of my tax liability. Several months later, I settled a rather large case on which I was paid a contingency fee large enough to allow me to satisfy my outstanding balance with the IRS. I called the local IRS office to speak to the agent who had been working with me. Another agent came on the line and told me the agent with whom I had been working had been reassigned, and that she would be handling my case instead. The conversation went like this. Mr. Smith has been working with me on my past due taxes, I began. I have the money to pay the entire balance due right now, and I need to know what the total is. Well, Mr. Bortz, why haven't you paid your taxes before now? Because I didn't have the money. Couldn't you have borrowed the money? Excuse me, ma'am, does it really matter why I haven't paid? I have the money now, and I want to go to the bank, get a cashier's check, and run it over to you right now, today, this afternoon. All I need to know is what I owe. Well, I want to know why you haven't paid before now. Like I told you, I didn't have the money. Well, you could have sold something to pay your taxes. This is rather ridiculous, isn't it? Here I am asking you for a figure so that I can bring certified funds over right now, and you won't even give it to me. Don't you have a legal obligation to tell a taxpayer how much money he owes when he requests the information? I'll get back to you. With that, the lovely Sandra hung up. I made a note to call her back the next morning and headed home. Early the next morning, my secretary rushed into my office to tell me that the lobby was full of IRS agents demanding to see me. I walked into my lobby to see the lovely Sandra accompanied by 3 gun-toting special agents. When I invited them back into my office, Sandra stepped up to my desk and slapped a notice of seizure down right in front of me. We're seizing your office building due to your failure to pay your income taxes. She then stomped out of the office, and the armed guards looked embarrassed. One of them actually winked at me and shrugged his shoulders. The entire matter was settled in hours. I finally got the payoff figure, delivered in the certified funds, and the seizure was canceled. In the summer of 1996, Bruce Barron's mother and sister had just arrived at Bruce's Cape Cod vacation home for a few days' relaxation. Entering the house that August morning, they noticed that the house smelled of car exhaust and soon discovered the horrific reason. They found Bruce in the garage, the body of the 47-year-old attorney slumped in the front of the car seat, having killed himself by carbon monoxide poisoning the previous evening. The IRS had placed liens against his property and had been harassing him for 4 years. The night before, he had received foreclosure notices on both his homes. His suicide note said, "The IRS is bigger than me," and went on to say, "Killing myself is much harder than I thought it would be. Carrie," his 16-year-old daughter, "will need everyone's love. I wish I could stay and see her continue to grow. There's no good solution. I'm sorry for hurting everyone by doing this." 4 years earlier, the IRS had come calling on the Barron family and informed Bruce and his accountant that $80,000 they deducted in business losses on his 1986 income tax return had been denied. Penalties and interest that had accrued in the intervening 6 years. While Bruce was unaware that he had done anything wrong, had increased his debt to the feds to a staggering $200,000. The IRS officer then refused, without explanation or comment, a payment offer made by Bruce under the IRS's Offering Compromise program, and instead garnished his wife Shirley's wages, placed liens against all their personal property, informed business associates and banks that the Barons had outstanding taxes due, and even seized $300 from 13-year-old Carrie's bank account. The IRS agent then went to the courthouses where Bruce plied his trade and told his clients and judges about the tax troubles, telling Bruce that she was going to put him out of business. The agent was ultimately successful in humiliating and bankrupting Bruce. Drained of every last reservoir of financial and emotional strength by an arrogant, unaccountable government thug, he ended his life. Bruce Barron's wife and teenage daughter were left without their husband and father, and the IRS and the federal income tax had claimed another of its thousands of helpless victims. Now, it's interesting that Todd mentions thousands of victims, because the stories here told, I understand they are anecdotal, but the history of the IRS is more of the same. If we look back into history, the IRS has been used by different presidents, including Nixon, Kennedy, and FDR, to attack their political opponents and benefit their supporters. A more comprehensive overview can be found in two different books. The first book, 1990 book called A Law Unto Itself, Power, Politics, and the IRS by David Burnham. That book documents many cases of terror committed by the IRS. Moreover, Senator William Roth, a Republican from Delaware, conducted comprehensive investigations into the IRS and published the findings in his 1999 book, The Power to Destroy. And even as recent as 2012, the Treasury Department's Inspector General reports reveal that the IRS has continued its long history of terror against the citizens. At a minimum, I think that it's fair to say that American citizens are not treated with respect, their property is not treated with respect, and I think that this is more than enough reason to start making changes to the tax system. So with that said, in the next podcast, what we'll do is we'll go over the actual specifics of the income tax, of the fair tax. We'll go over into the specifics, kind of go into things that I like about it, and we'll answer some of the questions that I think a lot of people will have, and we'll see what goes from there. All right. Thanks so much, and we'll see you soon.